Oncorhynchus is a genus of fish in the family Salmonidae. It contains the Pacific salmon and Pacific trout. The name of the genus is derived from the Greek onkos and rynchos, in reference to the hooked jaws of males in the mating season. Range: salmon and trout with native ranges in waters draining to the Pacific Ocean are members of the genus. The range extends from Beringia southwards, roughly to Taiwan in the western Mexico to the east. In North America, some subspecies of O. clarkii are native in the Rocky Mountains and Great Basin, while others are native to the Rio Grande and western tributaries of the Mississippi River basin which drain to the Gulf of Mexico, rather than to the Pacific. Several species of Oncorhynchus have been introduced into non-native waters around the globe, establishing self-sustaining wild populations. The 6 Pacific salmons of Oncorhynchus are anadromous and similparous. Migration can be affected by parasites. Infected individuals can become weak and probably have shortened lifespans. Infection with parasites creates an effect known as culling, whereby fish that are infected are less likely to complete the migration. Anadromous forms of Oncorhynchus micus known as steelhead Iotropis. The coastal cutthroat trout form of Oncorhynchus clarkii is considered semi-anadromous as it spends short periods of time in marine environments. Evolution: several late Miocene trout-like fossils in Idaho in the Clarkia lake beds appear to be of Oncorhynchus. The presence of these species so far inland established Oncorhynchus was not only present in the Pacific drainages before the beginning of the Pliocene, but also that rainbow and cutthroat trout and Pacific salmon lineages had diverged before the beginning of the Pliocene. Consequently, the split between Oncorhynchus and Salmo must have occurred well before the Pliocene. Suggested date signs have gone back as far as the early Miocene. One fossil species assigned to this genus, O. rastrosus, the saber-toothed salmon, is a 9-foot-long species known from late Miocene to Pleistocene fossils. Speciation among Oncorhynchus has been examined for decades, and a family tree is not yet completely developed for the Pacific salmonids. Mitochondrial DNA research has been completed on a variety of Pacific trout and salmonid species, but the results do not necessarily agree with fossil research or molecular research. Chum, pink and sockeye salmon lineages are generally agreed to have diverged in the sequence after other species. Montgomery discusses the pattern of the fossil record as compared to tectonic shifts in the plates of the Pacific Northwest of America. The divergence in Oncorhynchus lineages appear to follow the uprising of the Pacific Rim. The climatic and habitat changes that would follow such a geologic event are discussed, in the context of potential stress leading to adaptation and speciation. One interesting case involving speciation with salmon is that of the Kokanee sockeye. Kokanee sockeye evolved differently from anadromous sockeye. They reach the level of biological species. Biological species, as opposed to morphological species, are defined by the capacity to maintain themselves in symmetry as independent genetic entities. This definition can be vexing because it apparently applies only to symmetry, and this limitation makes the definition difficult to apply. Examples in Washington state, Canada, and elsewhere have 2 populations living in the same lake, but spawning in different substrates at different times, and eat different food sources. There is no pressure to compete or interbreed. These types of Kokanee salmon show the principal attributes of a biological species. They are reproductively isolated and show strong resources partitioning. Decline of Oncorhynchus populations. A general decline in overall Pacific salmon populations began in the mid-19th century. as the result of Western expansion and development in the U.S. Experts estimate salmon populations in the Columbia River Basin had been reduced to less than 20% of the pre-1850 levels by 1933. In 2008, Lackey estimated that Pacific salmon stocks in the Pacific Northwest were less than 10% of the pre-1850 numbers. Many of the remaining salmon runs are dominated by hatchery-raised salmon, not wild salmon. Many isolated subspecies of the Pacific trouts, particularly those of Oncorhynchus micus rainbow trout and Oncorhynchus clarkii cutthroat trout, have declined in the native ranges. Many local populations or distinct population segments of anadromous forms of steelhead have declined in the native ranges. The resulting declines have resulted in a number of populations of Oncorhynchus species as subspecies being listed as either endangered, threatened, or as species of special concern by state, federal, or international authorities. Two Oncorhynchus clarkii subspecies are considered extinct. Declines are attributed to a wide variety of causes: overfishing, habitat loss and degradation, artificial propagation, stocking, and hybridization, with a competition with introduced non-native species. For example, the yellowfin cutthroat trout is extinct as a result of the introduction of non-native rainbow trout into its native waters. Influence of hatcheries. Declines in the abundance of wild salmon due to overfishing placed greater pressure on hatcheries to increase production and restore the wild salmon stock to supply fisheries. The problem is that hatcheries can never truly replicate the environment of wild salmon, an issue which often results in physiological and behavioral differences between wild salmon and those reared in hatcheries. These differences are often the product of genetic changes associated with inbreeding, artificial selection, and natural selection, as well as different environmental pressures acting on hatchery fish than wild populations. Due to the size-selective nature of fishing favoring larger fish, a reduction in average size of the adult salmon has been observed over time. The smaller salmon make a greater proportion of the remaining individuals, continuing the population, and problems arise when these hatchery-reared fish are introduced into the wild populations. Unlike wild salmon, larger salmon are selected for in hatcheries and are typically much larger than wild salmon. The result is that hatchery-produced salmon tend to outcompete wild salmon for space, food, and other resources. Some salmon species in hatcheries exhibit predatory behavior toward wild salmon because they grow to be much larger, regardless of whether predation is observed. Natural social interactions are disturbed by the release of large numbers of hatchery-reared salmon where wild populations are low, because salmon in hatcheries naturally have a higher propensity towards aggressive behavior. Overall, natural salmon populations are put at risk when hatchery-reared salmon populations are introduced due to competition for resources, predation by larger individuals, and negative social interactions that upset the natural order observed in wild salmon populations. As a result, wild salmon populations are steadily dropping as the pressure to continue breeding salmon in hatcheries increases. Conservation efforts that work to place limitations on hatcheries to increase the wild salmon populations are hindered by financial pressures, because hatcheries effectively support many states economically by accounting for over 70% of the salmon harvested for recreational and commercial purposes. Influence of overfishing. Pacific salmon are harvested throughout the world as a source of food in countries ranging from the United States to South Korea. Over the past century, Pacific salmon have been extensively fished through both recreational, artisan, and commercial fishing. In fact, since the 1970s there has been a nearly threefold increase in catch of Pacific salmon. As this catch has increased, a selection of reduced body size has been observed. in Japanese chum salmon. For example, between 1970 and 1988 there has been a continuous decrease in body weight averaging between 11 and 32%. In part, this decline in body weight has been related to the size-selective effect of fishing gear used in the harvesting of salmon populations. Salmon of larger body weight are more apt to be caught during fishing efforts, causing lower body weight to be a beneficial character trait for survival. Thus, Pacific salmon have become continuously smaller in body size. However, studies have also shown that for Pacific salmon a larger mean size at the time of reproduction increases the survival of offspring. The life history of salmon favors delayed reproduction because fecundity increased with body size. Consequently, the smaller body size of salmon results in a negative impact on population growth by decreasing the survivability of progeny, and thus decreasing the growth rate of populations. This reduction of productivity in Pacific salmon is, in part, seeded in the overfishing and has caused a reduction in population sizes throughout Pacific salmon species. Today, it seems that population numbers of Pacific salmon are on the rise. However, the consequences from the overfishing in the 70s and 80s are still being reflected, with the average body size of salmon being smaller than before the event of overfishing. Conservation. Canadian efforts. There has been evidence that the sockeye salmon are affected by thermal conditions, and the responses to temperature are relatively strong and tend to vary from region to region. Canada has also used the Species at Risk Act to recognize the importance of biological diversity when it comes to the conservation of the salmon population. This means that multiple species of salmon would be looked at when it comes to conservation, as well as multiple areas that each species live in. COSEWIC, a Canadian organization for the conservation of species, has named the interior Fraser River coho, the Cultus lake sockeye, and the Sakanor lake sockeye to all be endangered. In British Columbia, sockeye salmon in 4 different watersheds were certified by the Marine Stewardship Council, or MSC, as sustainable fisheries in July 2010, and the certification is good for a period of 5 years. In 2011, MSC also certified the pink salmon fishery, and as of 2012 the chum salmon fisheries started the review under the MSC to become certified as a sustainable fishery. American efforts. The U.S. government has been working to develop a nationwide policy for the salmon populations. The Pacific Salmon Stronghold Conservation Act was resubmitted to Congress and, if passed, will create geographic strongholds for salmon populations. Other policies include the Wild Salmon Policy, which was enacted in 2005. Its #1 focus is the conservation of salmon off of the coast. Even localized policies have begun, with one in Oregon which focuses on the southernmost watershed and was approved January 2013. In the Alaskan efforts, there is evidence of 8 known regional groups of survival. It is also seen that the emigration of smolts from freshwater to other areas such as marine areas have shown significant consequences on the survival of different salmon groups. The Alaska Department of Fish and Game first received MSC, Marine Stewardship Council, certification in sustainable seafood back in 2000. Each certification is good for a period of 5 years, with yearly checkups to ensure that the fishery remains sustainable. It was renewed again in 2007, but in 2012 the ADFG left the program. The Annette Island Reserve salmon fishery is under the control of the Metlakatla Indian community, and as such was not included in the previous assessments of the Alaskan fisheries. It received its sustainability certification in June 2011. The Wild Salmon Center is a non-profit organization that works on promoting conservation efforts for salmon worldwide and in the United States. It has secured some of its 9 protected locations equaling 8 million acres for protected watershed areas for the West Coast salmon. Other efforts of the Wild Salmon Center include combating illegal fishing, maintaining sustainable fisheries, and creating local watersheds as new habitats. Russian efforts. Poaching is a threat to Oncorhynchus salmon and steelhead populations in Russia. It is estimated that illegal catching of salmon is 1.5 times more than the reported catch. The Wild Salmon Center is working with Russian authorities to try to help improve traceability systems so that markets and distinguish between legal, sustainable salmon and the illegal salmon. The Wild Salmon Center has secured some of its protected locations for the salmon populations. In efforts with the WWF, the Wild Salmon Center was also able to have a sockeye salmon fishery certified as completely sustainable in 2012. The Iturup Island pink and chum salmon fishery was first certified in 2009 and was the first Russian salmon fishery to receive certification in sustainability by MSC. Other fisheries that were certified by MSC include the Northeast Sakhalin Island pink salmon, certified in June 2012, and the Ozan-Arya River sockeye salmon, certified in September 2012. The Aniva Bay pink salmon and the Sakhalin Island pink salmon are both under review by the MSC. Introductions and aquaculture. Several species of Oncorhynchus have been successfully introduced into non-native waters, establishing self-sustaining wild populations. The rainbow trout Oncorhynchus mycos is the most widely introduced species of the genus. Rainbow trout, Chinook salmon Oncorhynchus shawithsha and coho salmon Oncorhynchus kisuj have established wild, self-sustaining populations in the Great Lakes and Chinook in New Zealand. Aquaculture of Chinook and coho salmon and rainbow trout are major industries in Chile and Australia. Chinook from Chile were released into Argentinian rivers, and there were stockings of coho and sockeye salmon and rainbow trout in Patagonia. Species. Some of the species in this genus are highly variable, and a number of now obsolete taxa have been described. In 1989, morphological and genetic studies by Gerald Smith and Ralph Sturley indicated that trouts of the Pacific Basin were genetically closer to Pacific salmon than to the salmus, brown trout or Atlantic salmon of the Atlantic Basin. Thus, in 1989, taxonomic authorities moved the rainbow cutthroat and other Pacific Basin trouts into the genus Oncorhynchus. Currently, 12 species and numerous subspecies in this genus are recognized. Menke, Oncorhynchus Apache trout, Arizona trout, Oncorhynchus chrysogaster, Mexican golden trout, Oncorhynchus clarkii, cutthroat trout OC, clarkii, coastal cutthroat trout OC, Bouvieri, Yellowstone cutthroat trout OC, Lucy, Westslope cutthroat trout OC, Chlorocticus, Colorado River cutthroat trout OC, Alvadensis, Alvid cutthroat trout OC, Menke, Snake River fine spotted cutthroat trout OC, Clark F. Crescentii, Lake Crescent cutthroat trout, Crescenti trout OC, Henshawi, Lahontan cutthroat trout OC, McDonaldie, Yellowfin cutthroat trout OC, Salinearies, Paiute cutthroat trout OC, Stomias, Greenback cutthroat trout OC, Utah, Bonneville cutthroat trout OC, Virginalis, Rio Grande cutthroat trout, Oncorhynchus gili, Gila trout, Oncorhynchus gorbusha, pink salmon, humpback salmon, Oncorhynchus kuamure, Kunimasu, black kokanee, Oncorhynchus keta, chum salmon, dog salmon, ketab salmon, silver bright salmon. Oncorhynchus kisachko ho salmon, silver salmon, silvers. Oncorhynchus masu salmon, cherry salmon, Japanese salmon, simaro. Masu salmon, cherry salmon, Japanese salmon. Formosanus, Formosan landlocked salmon, Taiwanese salmon. Macrostomus, amigard, red-spotted masu salmon. Ishikawa, Satsuki masu salmon, Jamami. Rhodurus ds. Jordan and Amp. E. A. McGregor, 1925. B. Were trout. Var. Awame Sero Kimura and Amp. M. Nakamura, 1961. Awame trout, markless trout, interpopulation variant. Oncorhynchus micus, rainbow trout, steelhead, ocean trout, red-band trout, Kamchatkan rainbow trout. Aguabonita, golden trout. Iridius F. Beardsley E. Beardsley trout. Newberry, Great Basin red-band trout. Iridius, coastal rainbow trout. Gardneri, Columbia River red-band trout. Stoney, McCloud River red-band trout. Nelsoni, Baja California rainbow trout. SSP, Mexican native trout. Gilberti, Kern River rainbow trout. White, Little Kern River golden trout. Oncorhynchus nerka, sockeye salmon, red salmon, blueback salmon, kokanee. Oncorhynchus shawithsha, chinook salmon, blackmouth, black salmon, chub salmon, Columbia River salmon, hookbill salmon, king salmon, quinnet salmon, spring salmon, Thai salmon, winter salmon.